Welcome back. Alright, so we are at chapter 40, which is Capture at Gil'ead. Riding was extremely painful for Aragon. His broken ribs prevented him from going faster than a walk, and it was impossible for him to breathe deeply without a burst of agony. Nevertheless, he refused to stop. Saphira flew close by, her mind linked with his for solace and strength. Murtagh rode confidently beside Cadoc, flowing smoothly with his horse's movements. Aragon watched the gray animal for a while. "You have a beautiful horse. What's his name?" "Tornak, after a man who taught me to fight." Murtagh patted the horse's side. "He was given to me when he was just a foal. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more courageous and intelligent animal in all of Aglacia. Saphira excepted, of course." "He's a magnificent beast," said Aragon admiringly. Murtagh laughed. "Yes, but Snowfire is a close match. Closest as I've ever seen." They covered only a short distance that day. Yet Aragon was glad to be on the move again. It kept his mind off other more morbid matters. They were riding through unsettled land. The road to Drasleona was several leagues to their left. They would skirt the city by a wide margin on the way to Gil'ead, which was almost as far north as Carvajal. They sold Cadoc in a small village. As the horse was led away by his new owner, Aragon regretfully pocketed the few coins he had gained from the transaction. It was difficult to relinquish Cadoc. After crossing half of Aglacia and outracing Urgles on him, the days rolled by unnoticed as their small group traveled in isolation. Aragon was pleased to find that he and Murtagh shared many of the same interests. They spent hours debating the finer points of archery and hunting. There was one subject, however, they avoided discussing by unspoken consent: their pasts. Aragon did not explain how he had found Saphira, met Brom, or where he came from. Murtagh was likewise mute as to why the Empire was chasing him. It was a simple agreement, but it worked. Yet, because of their proximity, it was inevitable that they learned about each other. Aragon was intrigued by Murtagh's familiarity with the power, struggles, and politics within the Empire. He seemed to know what every other noble and courtier was doing, and how it affected everyone else. Aragon listened carefully, suspicions whirling through his mind. The first week went by without a sign of the Razak, which allayed some of Aragon's fears. Even so, they still kept watches at night. Aragon had expected to encounter Urgles on the way to Gil'ead, but they had found no trace of them. "I thought these remote places would be teeming with monsters," he mused. "Still, I'm not one to complain if they've gone elsewhere." He dreamed of the woman no more, and though he tried to scry her, he saw only an empty cell. Whenever they passed a town or city, he checked to see if it had a jail. If it did, he would disguise himself and visit it. But she was not to be found. His disguises became increasingly elaborate, as he saw notices featuring his name and description, and offering a substantial reward for his capture, posted in various towns. Their travels north forced them towards the capital, Rubian. It was a heavily populated area, which made it difficult to escape notice. Soldiers patrolled the roads and guarded the bridges. It took them several tense, irritable days to skirt the capital. Once they felt they were safely past Rubian, they found themselves on the edge of a vast plain. It was the very same one that Aragon had crossed after leaving the Palancar Valley, except now he was on the opposite side. They kept to the perimeter of the plain and continued north, following the Rammer River. Aragon's 16th birthday came and went during this time. At Carvajal, a celebration would have been held for his entrance into manhood, but in the wilderness he did not even mention it to Murtagh. At nearly 6 months of age, Saphira was much larger. Her wings were massive. Every inch of them was needed to lift her muscular body and thick bones. The fangs that jutted from her jaw were nearly as thick as Aragon's fist, their points as sharp as Zarok. The day finally came when Aragon unwrapped his side for the last time. His ribs had healed completely, leaving him with only a small scar where a Razak's boot had cut his side. As Saphira watched, he stretched slowly, then with increasing vigor. When there was no pain, he flexed his muscles, pleased. In an earlier time he would have smiled, but after Brom's death such expressions did not come easily. He tugged his tunic on and walked back to the small fire they had made. Murtagh sat next to it, whittling a piece of wood. Aragon drew Zarok. Murtagh tensed, though his face remained calm. "Now that I'm strong enough, would you like to spar?" asked Aragon. Murtagh tossed the wood to the side. "With sharpened swords? We could kill each other." "Here, give me your sword," said Aragon. Murtagh hesitated, then handed over his long hand-and-a-half sword. Aragon blocked the edges with magic, the way Brom taught him. While Murtagh examined the blade, Aragon said, "I can undo that once we're finished." Murtagh checked the balance of his sword. Satisfied, he said, "It will do." Aragon safed Zarok, settled into a crouch, then swung at Murtagh's shoulder. Their swords met in midair. Aragon disengaged with a flourish, thrust, and then riposted as Murtagh parried, dancing away. "He's fast," thought Aragon. They struggled back and forth, trying to batter each other down. After a particularly intense series of blows, Murtagh started laughing. Not only was it impossible for either of them to gain an advantage, but they were so evenly matched that they tired at the same rate. Acknowledging with grins each other's skill, they fought on until their arms were leaden and sweat poured off their sides. Finally, Aragon called, "Enough! Halt!" Murtagh stopped in mid-blow and sat down with a gasp. Aragon staggered to the ground, his chest heaving. None of his fights with Brom had been this fierce. As he gulped air, Murtagh exclaimed, "You're amazing! I've studied swordplay all my life, but never have I fought one like you. You could be the king's weapon master if you wanted to." "You're just as good," observed Aragon, still panting. "The man who taught you, Tornak, could make a fortune with a fencing school. People will come from all parts of Gil'ead to learn from him." "He's dead," said Murtagh shortly. "I'm sorry." Thus it became their custom to fight in the evening, which kept them lean and fit. Like a pair of matched blades, with his return to health, Aragon also resumed practicing magic. Murtagh was curious about it and soon revealed that he knew a surprising amount about how it worked, though he lacked the precise details and could not use it himself. Whenever Aragon practiced speaking in the ancient language, Murtagh would listen quietly, occasionally asking what a word meant. On the outskirts of Gil'ead, they stopped the horses side by side. It had taken them nearly a month to reach it, during which time he had finally nudged away the remains of winter. Spring had finally nudged away the remains of winter. Aragon had felt himself changing during the trip, growing stronger and calmer. He still thought about Brom and spoke about him with Saphira, but for the most part he tried not to awaken painful memories. From a distance they could see the city was a rough, barbaric place, filled with log houses and yapping dogs. There was a rambling stone fortress at its center. The air was hazy with blue smoke. The place seemed like a temporary trading post, more than a permanent city. 5 miles beyond, it was the hazy outline of Isenstar Lake. They decided to camp 2 miles from the city for safety. While their dinner simmered, Murtagh said, "I'm not sure you should be the one to go into Gil'ead." "Why? I can disguise myself well enough," said Aragon. "And Dorman will want to see the Gedway and Ignazia as proof I really am a rider." "Perhaps," said Murtagh, "but the Empire wants you much more than me. If I'm captured, I could eventually escape. But if you are taken, they'll drag you to the king, or you'll be in for a slow death by torture, unless you join him. Plus, in Gil'ead, there's one army's major staging points. Those aren't houses out there, they're barracks. Going in there would be like handing yourself to the king on a gilded platter." Aragon asked Saphira for her opinion. She wrapped her tail around his legs and lay next to him. "You shouldn't have to ask me. He speaks sense. There are certain words I can give that will convince him of Dormand and his truthfulness. And Murtagh's right. If anyone is to risk capture, it should be him, because he will live through it." He grimaced. "I don't like putting him in danger for us." "All right, you can go," he said reluctantly. "But if anything goes wrong, I'm coming after you." Murtagh laughed. "That would be fit for a legend. How a lone rider took on the king's armies single-handedly." He chuckled again and stood. "Is there anything I should know before going?" "Shouldn't we rest and wait until tomorrow?" asked Aragon cautiously. Why? The longer we stay here, the greater the chance that we'll be discovered. If this doorman can take you to the Varden, then he needs to be found as quickly as possible. Neither of us should remain in Gilead longer than a few days. Again, wisdom flies from his mouth, commented Saphira dryly. She told Aragon what should be said to Dormund, and he relayed the information to Murtagh. Very well, said Murtagh, adjusting his sword. Unless there's trouble, I'll be back within a couple of hours. Make sure there's some food left for me. With a wave of his hand, he jumped onto Tornak and rode away. Aragon sat by the fire, tapping Zarok's pommel apprehensively. Hours passed, but Murtagh did not return. Aragon paced around the fire, Zarok in hand, while Saphira watched Gil'ead attentively. Only her eyes moved. Neither of them voiced their worries, though Aragon unobtrusively prepared to leave, in case a detachment of soldiers had left the city and was headed towards their camp. Look, snapped Saphira. Aragon swiveled towards Gil'ead, alert. He saw a distant horseman exit the city and ride furiously towards their camp. I don't like this, he said, as he climbed into Saphira. Be ready to fly. I'm prepared for more than that. As the rider approached, Aragon recognized Murtagh bent low over Tornak. No one seemed to be pursuing him, but he did not slow his reckless pace. He galloped into the camp and jumped to the ground, drawing his sword. What's wrong? Asked Aragon. Murtagh scowled. Did anyone follow me from Gilead? We didn't see anyone. Good, then let me explain. Let me eat before I explain. I'm starving. He seized a bowl and began eating with gusto. After a few sloppy bites, he said with a full mouth, Dormund has agreed to meet us outside Gilead at sunrise tomorrow. If he's satisfied you really are a rider, and it's not a trap, he'll take you to the Varden. Where are we supposed to meet him? Asked Aragon. Murtagh pointed west. On a small hill across the road. So what happened? Murtagh spooned more food into his bowl. It's a rather simple thing, but all the more deadly because of it. I was seen in the street by someone who knows me. I did the only thing I could and ran away. It was too late, though. He recognized me. It was unfortunate, but Aragon was unsure how bad it really was. Since I don't know your friend, I'll have to ask. Will he tell anyone? Murtagh gave a strained laugh. If you had met him, that wouldn't need answering. His mouth is loosely hinged and hangs open all the time, vomiting whatever happens to be in his mind. The question isn't whether he'll tell people, but whom he will tell. If a word of this reaches the wrong ears, we'll be in trouble. I doubt the soldiers will be sent to search for you in the dark, Aragon pointed out. We can at least count on being safe until morning, and by then, if all goes well, we'll be leaving with Dormund. Murtagh shook his head. No, only you will accompany them. As I said before, I won't go to the Varden. Aragon stared at him unhappily. He wanted Murtagh to stay. They had become good friends during their travels, and he was loath to tear them apart. He started to protest, but Saphira hushed him and said very gently, Wait until tomorrow. Now is not the time. Very well, he said glumly. They talked until the stars were bright in the sky, then slept as Saphira took the first watch. Aragon woke up 2 hours before dawn, his palm tingling. Everything was still quiet, but something caught his attention, like an itch in his mind. He buckled on Zarok and stood, careful not to make a sound. Saphira looked at him cautiously, her large eyes bright. What is it? She asked. I don't know, said Aragon. He saw nothing amiss. Saphira sniffed the air curiously. She hissed a little and lifted her head. I smell horses nearby, but they're not moving. They reek with an unfamiliar stench. Aragon crept to Murtagh and shook his shoulder. Murtagh woke with a start, yanking a dagger from under the blankets, then looked at Aragon, quizzically. Aragon motioned for him to be silent, whispering, There are horses close by. Murtagh wordlessly drew his sword. They quietly stationed themselves on either side of Saphira, preparing for an attack. As they waited, the morning star rose in the east. A squirrel chattered. Then an angry snarl from behind made Aragon spin around, sword held high. A broad Urgle stood at the edge of the camp, carrying a mattock with a nasty spike. Where did he come from? We haven't seen their tracks anywhere, thought Aragon. The Urgle roared and waved his weapon, but did not charge. Brisinger! Barked Aragon, stabbing out with magic. The Urgle's face contorted with terror as he exploded in a flash of blue light. Blood spattered Aragon, and a brown mass flew through the air. Behind him, Saphira bulged with alarm and reared. Aragon twisted around. While he had been occupied with the first Urgle, a group of them had run up from the side. Of all the stupid tricks to fall for. Steel clashed loudly as Murtagh attacked the Urgles. Aragon tried to join him, but was blocked by 4 of the monsters. The first one swung a sword at his shoulder. He ducked the blow and killed the Urgle with magic. The second one he caught in the throat with Zarok, wheeled wildly, and slashed the third through the heart. As he did, the 4th Urgle rushed at him, swinging a heavy club. Aragon saw him coming, and tried to lift his sword to block the club, but he was a second too slow. As the club came down on his head, he screamed, "Fly, Saphira!" And a burst of light filled his eyes, and he lost consciousness. Chapter 41. Du Sundvar Freyr? Du Sundvar Freyr. The first things Aragon noticed were that he was warm and dry. His cheek was pressed against rough fabric and his hands were unbound. He stirred, but it was minutes before he was able to push himself upright and examine his surroundings. He was sitting in a cell on a narrow, bumpy cot. A barred window was set high in the wall. The iron-bound door, with a small window on its top half, barred like the one in the wall, was shut securely. Dried blood caked on Aragon's face when he moved. It took him a moment to remember that it was not his. His head hurt horribly, which was to be expected, considering the blow he had taken. But his mind was strangely fuzzy. He tried to use magic, but could not concentrate well enough to remember any of the ancient words. They must have drugged me, he finally decided. With a groan, he got up, missing the familiar weight of Zarok on his hip, and lurched into the window in the wall. He managed to see out of it by standing on his toes. It took a full minute for his eyes to adjust to the bright light outside. The window was level with the ground. A street full of busy people ran past the side of his cell, beyond which were rows of identical log houses. Feeling weak, Aragon slid to the floor and stared at it blankly. What he had seen outside disturbed him, but he was unsure why. Cursing his sluggish thinking, he leaned back his head and tried to clear his mind. A man entered the room and set a tray of food and pitcher of water on the cot. Wasn't that nice of him, thought Aragon, smiling pleasantly. He took up a couple bites of the thin cabbage soup and stale bread, but he was barely able to stomach it. I wish he had brought me something better, he complained, dropping the spoon. Suddenly, realizing what was wrong, I was captured by Urgles, not men. How did I end up here? His befuddled brain grappled with this paradox unsuccessfully. With a mental shrug, he filed the discovery away for a time, when he would know what to do with it. He sat on the cot and gazed into the distance. Hours later, more food was brought in. And I was just getting hungry, he thought thickly. This time, he was able to eat without feeling sick. When he finished, he decided it was time for a nap. After all, he was on a bed. What else was he going to do? His mind drifted off. Sleep began to envelop him. Then a gate clanged open somewhere, and the din of steel-shod boots marching on the stone floor filled the air. The noise grew louder and louder until it sounded like someone banging a pot inside Aragon's head. He grumbled to himself, "Can't they let me rest in peace?" Fuzzy curiosity slowly overcame his exhaustion, so he dragged himself to the door, blinking like an owl. Through the window he saw a wide hallway, nearly 10 yards across. The opposing wall was lined with cells, similar to his own. A column of soldiers marched through the hall, their swords drawn and ready. Every man was dressed in matching armor. Their faces bore the same hard expression, and their feet came down on the floor with mechanical precision, never missing a beat. The sound was hypnotic. It was an impressive display of force. Aragon watched the soldiers until he grew bored. Then he just noticed a break in the middle of the column. Carried between 2 burly men was an unconscious woman. Her long, midnight black hair obscured her face, despite a leather strip bound around her head to hold the terraces back. She was dressed in dark leather pants and shirt. Wrapped around her thin waist was a shiny belt, from which hung an empty sheath on her right hip. Knee-high boots covered her calves and small feet. Her head lolled to the side. Aragon gasped, feeling like he had been struck in the stomach. She was the woman from his dreams. Her sculpted face was as perfect as a painting. Her round chin, high cheekbones, and long eyelashes gave her an exotic look. The only mar in her beauty was a scrape along her jaw. Nevertheless, she was the fairest woman he had ever seen. Aragorn's blood burned as he looked at her. Something awoke in him, something he had never felt before. It was like an obsession, except stronger, almost a fevered madness. Then the woman's hair shifted, revealing pointed ears. A chill crept over him. She was an elf. The soldiers continued marching, taking her from his sight. Next strode a tall, proud man, a sable cape billowing from behind. His face was deathly white. His hair was red like blood. As he walked by Aragorn's cell, the man turned his head and looked squarely at him with maroon eyes. His upper lip pulled back in a feral smile, revealing teeth filed to points. Aragorn shrank back. He knew what that man was. A shade. So help me, a shade. The procession continued, and the shade vanished from view. Aragorn sank to the floor, hugging himself. Even in his bewildered state, he knew that the presence of a shade meant that evil was loose in the land. Whenever they appeared, rivers of blood were sure to follow. What is this shade doing here? The soldier should have killed him on sight. Then his thoughts returned to the elf woman. He was grasped by strange emotions again. I have to escape. But with his mind clouded, his determination quickly faded. He returned to the cot. By the time the hallway fell silent, he was fast asleep. As soon as Aragorn opened his eyes, he knew something was different. It was easier for him to think. He realized that he was in Gilead. They had made a mistake. The drugs wearing off. Hopeful, he tried to contact Saphira and used magic, but both activities were still beyond his reach. A pity of worry twisted inside of him as he wondered if she and Murtagh had managed to escape. He stretched his arms out and looked out the window. The city was just awakening. The street was empty except for 2 beggars. He reached for a water pitcher, ruminating about the elf and the shade. As he started to drink, he noticed that the water had a faint odor, as if it contained a few drops of rancid perfume. Grimacing, he set the pitcher down. The drug must be in there, and maybe the food as well. He remembered when the Razak had drugged him. It had taken hours to wear off. If I can keep from drinking and eating for long enough, I should be able to use magic. Then I can rescue the elf. The thought made him smile. He sat in the corner, dreaming about how it could be done. The portly jailer entered the cell about an hour later with a tray of food. Aragorn waited until he departed, then carried the tray to the window. The meal was composed of only bread, cheese, and an onion, but the smell made his stomach grumble hungrily. Resigning himself to a miserable day, he shoved the food out the window and onto the street, hoping that no one would notice. Aragorn devoted himself to overcoming the drug's effects. He had difficulty concentrating for any length of time, but as the day progressed, his mental acuity increased. He began to remember several of the ancient words, though nothing happened when he uttered them. He wanted to scream with frustration. When lunch was delivered, he pushed it out the window after his breakfast. His hunger was distracting, but it was the lack of water that taxed him most. The back of his throat was parched. Thoughts of drinking cool water tortured him, as each breath dried his mouth and throat a bit more. Even so, he forced himself to ignore the pitcher. He was diverted from his discomfort by a commotion in the hall. A man argued with a loud voice. "You can't go in there. The orders were very clear. No one is to see him." "Really? Will you be the one to die stopping me, Captain?" cut in a smooth voice. There was subdued... "No, but the king!" "I will handle the king," interrupted the second person. "Now unlock the door." After a pause, keys jangled outside Aragorn's cell. He tried to adopt a languorous expression. "I have to act like I don't understand what's going on. I can't show surprise, no matter what this person says." The door opened. His breath caught as he looked into the shade's face. It was like gazing at a death mask or a polished skull with skin pulled over it to give it the appearance of life. "Greetings," said the shade with a cold smile, showing his filed teeth. "I've waited a long time to meet you." Who are you?" asked Aragorn, slurring his words. "No one of consequence," answered the shade, his maroon eyes alight with controlled menace. He sat with a flourish of his cloak. "My name does not matter to one in your position. It wouldn't mean a thing to you anyway. It's you that I'm interested in. Who are you?" The question was posed innocently enough, but Aragorn knew that there had to be a trap in it, though it eluded him. He pretended to struggle to answer the question for a while, then slowly said, frowning, "I'm not sure. My name's Aragorn, but that's not all I am, is it?" The shade's narrow lips stretched tautly over his mouth, and he laughed sharply. "No, it isn't. You have an interesting mind, my young rider." He leaned forward. The skin on his forehead was thin and translucent. "It seems I must be more direct. What is your name?" No, not that one." The shade cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Don't you have another one? One that you use only rarely?" "He wants my true name so he can control me," realized Aragon. "But I can't tell him. I don't even know it myself." He thought quickly, trying to invent a deception that would conceal his ignorance. "What if I make up a name?" He hesitated. It could easily give him away. Then raced to create a name that would withstand scrutiny. As he was about to utter it, he decided to take the chance and try to scare the shade. He deftly switched a few letters, then nodded foolishly and said, "Brom once told it to me." It was... The pause stretched out for a few seconds. Then his face brightened when he appeared to remember. "It was Du Sendevar Furor," which meant almost literally death of the shadows. A grim chill settled over the cell as the shade sat motionless, eyes veiled. He seemed to be deep in thought, pondering what he had learned. Aragon wondered if he had dared too much. He waited until the shade stirred before asking ingenuously, "Why are you here?" The shade looked at him with contempt in his red eyes and smiled. Oh, that was Aragon. "To gloat, of course. What use is a victory if one can't enjoy it?" Where there was confidence in his voice, but he seemed uneasy, as if his plans had been disrupted. He stood suddenly. "I must attend to certain matters. But while I am gone, you would do well to think on who you would rather serve, a rider who betrayed your own order, or a fellow man like me, though one skilled in the arcane arts. When the time comes to choose, there will be no middle ground." He turned to leave, then glanced at Aragon's water pitcher and stopped, his face granite hard. "Captain!" he snapped. A broad-shouldered man rushed into the cell, sword in hand. What is it, my lord?" he asked, alarmed. "Put that toy away," instructed the shade. He turned to Aragon and said in a deadly quiet voice, "The boy hasn't been drinking his water. Why is that?" "I talked with the jailer earlier. Every bowl of food and plate was scraped clean." "Very well," said the shade, mollified. "But make sure that he starts drinking again." He leaned towards the captain and murmured into his ear. Aragon caught the last few words. "Extra dose, just in case." The captain nodded. The shade returned his attention to Aragon. "We will talk again tomorrow, when I am not so pressed for time. You should know, I have an endless fascination for names. I will greatly enjoy discussing yours in much greater detail." The way he said it gave Aragon a sinking feeling. Once they left, he lay on the cot and closed his eyes. Brom's lessons proved their worth now. He relied on them to keep himself from panicking, and to reassure himself, "Everything has been provided for me. I only have to take advantage of it." His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching soldiers. Apprehensive, he went to the door and saw 2 soldiers dragging the elf down the hallway. When he could see her no more, Aragon slumped to the floor and tried to touch the magic again. Oaths flew from his lips when it eluded his grasp. He looked out at the city and ground his teeth. It was only mid-afternoon. Taking a calming breath, he tried to wait patiently. And that is the end of that chapter. I'll read the next at a later date.